Hi, this is Brass Check, and we're recording this on a productive Thursday morning, August 12th. And yesterday we had the privilege of interviewing Alex Guttentag. She is the author of a very important article called The War on Reality. We'll put a link below. It came out on June 28th, 2021 on the uncensored platform Tablet. She and I talked about if this had been posted on the Bill Gates funded medium.com, it would have been taken down. But basically, Alex, who is a school teacher, did what I've been begging professional journalists to do now for a year and a half. Please create a document that shows not every lie, because that would be the Encyclopedia Britannica, but a good survey of the various lies that we have been told, when they were told, what the truth turned out to be. I cannot get the professional journalistic community to do that. They prefer to, I don't know what they prefer to do, but this is a document that we frankly have all needed for a long time, and I want to thank her for writing it. I also want to thank her for speaking on behalf of children and her students. She is really clear about the damage that the COVID con is doing to children. And if you haven't given any thought to that, maybe now is the time to do that. So in a second, we're going to hear the whole interview that I did with her, and I'm really, again, honored and to speak with her. And it's great to see, I never thought I'd be saying this because I never thought I'd be an old guy, but it's great to see young people really standing up for what's right. One of the things we talked about, which surprised me because I just wasn't aware, is that in addition to torturing these children, creating impossible situations for them. I mean, you're going to put a kindergarten student in front of a computer all day to do remote learning? Excuse me. Are you kidding? I mean, that's psychotic. That makes no sense at all. And then the masking of children, I mean, it's demonic. And it's being done by good, well-intentioned people who can't be bothered to do any research and do any independent thinking. But they'll allow children to be abused systematically by these institutions. But anyway, we talked about something else, which is, this is the obvious problem, but we also talked about the standards now. Academic standards are gone. They don't exist anymore. Like before, you used to try to make sure kids knew how to read and they achieved a certain level of proficiency in math and reading, and all that's just out the window. And I hadn't thought about that. But what else are they going to do? They have basically interrupted very important. When you're 6 years old, I mean, you're 6 years old, you're just starting to learn how to read, and somebody interrupts that for a year and a half. You think there might be some consequences to that, but rather than address the consequences, our great educational system has decided to solve the problem by throwing out standards. And we've got the state of Oregon and the governor there. Remember, these are the people that pushed the measles hysteria, and they pushed the COVID con as hard as it could be pushed. They've also allowed their cities to be occupied and taken over by random maniacs, and that's okay. Tragedy. But anyway, here's where this leads now. If you are a student in Oregon in the current era, you no longer need to be able to demonstrate you can read or do arithmetic, addition and subtraction, to get a high school diploma in Oregon. This requirement was suspended during the pandemic, and now it's been extended. And the idea is this is going to help disadvantaged students who historically test poorly. Specifically, it's going to help Oregon's Black, Latino, Latina, Latinx. By the way, only I think 3% of people of Latino heritage use Latinx. They don't like it. They don't want it. It's stupid, but we've got to use it. So Latino, Latina, Latinx, Indigenous, Asian, Pacific Islander, Tribal, and students of color, which I guess includes somebody with a good suntan. I mean, the insanity of this just boggles my mind. So basically, to help the disadvantaged, we're going to throw all academic standards out the window, and we're not going to make sure that kids know how to read and write and do basic arithmetic before they get a high school diploma. And this is somehow serving children and serving these young people and their families. I think it's obvious this is a fraud, and apparently this is a nationwide movement now to end testing as a requirement of high school graduation. The state of Oregon will no longer require its students to demonstrate proficiency in math, reading, and writing in order to earn a high school diploma, in a bid to bolster minority students. How about creating programs to help? Because believe me, there are certainly children that are coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. By the way, of all colors, of all ethnic backgrounds, of all ancestries. What makes you think there aren't desperately poor white children from families that are having difficulties? That doesn't exist. I mean, this is so insane. But it is where things are going. So rather than spend the money, time, and effort to figure out how we can help children in difficulty and make sure they learn these important life skills of knowing how to read, knowing how to do arithmetic, we're just going to throw the standards out. So this is where we're at. And I love it. They're doing it in the name of diversity and equity and whatever other bullshit they can cook up. So anyway, these are my opinions alone. I don't know what Alex's opinion is on this, so don't pin these opinions on her. But we're now going to go to this interview with her. And again, really, it made my day to talk with a young person, a teacher who has been outspoken and has stood up for her students and called fraud and abuse on everything that is currently going on in our schools. By the way, if you're from a family with money, you've got Wi-Fi at home. You've got all the computers in the world. You've got parents who were lucky enough to be educated and might be able to help you. That is not the average typical kid in America these days. There's a huge percentage of kids, probably 30, could be as high as 40%, for whom those things do not apply. So what happens to them when you close the schools and everything goes virtual? You've basically ensured those kids have zero. Those kids who were already struggling, already in need of some kind of, and I'm not a fan of public schools or the way schools are run, believe me, but it's better than nothing. And for a lot of these kids, school was a refuge, and it was a chance for them to get some kind of help, some kind of intervention, some kind of support, and that's been taken away from them. And that's one of the many evils of this COVID con. And again, we're going to hear from Alex, and I want to thank her for giving us the time and the benefit of her insight. So we're interviewing Alex Gutentag today. Alex is a teacher in the East Bay, I believe Oakland. Is it Oakland? Yeah. And Alex came to my attention in June when she wrote this wonderful article called The War on Reality. And I've been asking professional journalists since February of 2020, could you please write an article that documents all the blatant fraud in the COVID narration? And they're all too busy. So I said, okay, hopefully someday somebody will do it. So Alex wrote this article, which does a really good job of summarizing all the nonsense that we've been told. But she does something else equally as important, maybe even more important. She highlights the suffering this fraud has caused for children. And it is bizarre to me how few people are talking about this issue. It's one of the most important issues to me related to this whole thing. Initially, children were blamed for killing grandpa or grandma. Um, Now they're being treated as if they're toxic waste because they're not vaccinated yet. It's despicable. It's as despicable as it can possibly be. So Alex is in the front line, and she's going to talk about what the first year of the lockdowns was like as a teacher in the schools. And we all should hear this story because it's very, very important. So first, we were kind of joking. It's not really funny. I originally called San Francisco, which is the city across the bay from Oakland, a digital banana republic in 1997. And I did that because of the way this public schools were being treated. And the thing that particularly got my ire was they didn't have reliable running water in many of the bathrooms in the public school system. So here it is, fast forward to 2020, and what was your experience being in the Oakland school system with that one small detail?
Yeah, so I was just saying it's kind of funny because right before the schools closed, we didn't have a lot of the time soap in the kids' bathrooms or toilet paper stock sometimes. We didn't have cleaning wipes if teachers requested them. And now, of course, once the schools open back up, there's tons of cleaning supplies everywhere. And I know I was seeing huge bottles of hand sanitizer in my room every day.
In your classroom?
Yeah, brought to me, which is way too much for anyone to use. So I think that it's just funny because there was never a budget for cleaning supplies before, and now there's a huge amount of money for cleaning supplies that are just hygiene theater and don't really do anything for this virus. So
we both can probably agree that washing hands is a great idea.
Yeah, it's a great idea in general at all times.
and it would have been nice if the school system had soap in the children's bathrooms,
yeah,
which they didn't think was important. The other thing that we should probably mention, because it's one of the many frauds of this, is that hand sanitizer is for bacteria. It's not going to do anything, from my understanding, with viruses. It's primarily a bacterial thing. So it's not even a. I mean, it's still good to wash your hands no matter what. But it's as you say. What did you call it? Theater? What kind of theater?
Hygiene theater.
Hygiene theater, yeah.
Yeah.
Or biosecurity theater.
Yeah.
So initially, children were being portrayed at the very beginning of this as dangerous. That they were likely, not just possible, but likely to kill grandma just by their very existence. And by the way, I don't know if you knew this, but I found out that was cooked up specifically by some German, by people in the German government. That was out. They sat down and they worked that story out, and it got legs and it spread. So it was there's no science behind any of it. It is story.
Yeah.
So now we're back to that because children are they're not vaccinated because the FDA won't permit it. Thank God.
For now.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. We need to talk about that. And now they're being presented as these dangerous figures who need to be masked and need to be kept away from people, and et cetera, et cetera. So let's talk about the suffering, because no one's talking about this, and I'm glad you're writing about it. Let's talk about the suffering of children through this, what you observed as a teacher.
Yeah, so when the schools first closed and it was just going to be for a couple weeks, there was no plan in place. Absolutely no plan in place for how Zoom was going to work. And it was basically like, we're just throwing away this 2 weeks of school was kind of the attitude. And then a huge problem happened because then it became the rest of the school year, the schools in California are closed. And if we had started with that attitude that these 2 weeks don't matter and there was no plans made for a full, couple months, or some school districts, maybe 2.5 months of school closed, it ended up that a lot of kids just didn't get any education during that time. So that's the first thing. They didn't have computers. A lot of low-income kids did not have computers at home they could use, or internet. So even after it became clear that we were going to be doing this for the rest of the school year, and schools started to distribute computers, they kids did not have internet, and a lot of places that ended up having maybe 30% of kids still without any capacity to access school in the spring of 2020. Then over the summer, there was talk of opening up, and then that talk was quickly, I don't know,
Welched.
press, yeah. And then the plan became, we're gonna do online school. So there was a huge influx of donations from tech companies to pay for hotspots for kids who did not have internet, and a lot of investment in making Zoom school sort of work. So that was an improvement because at least kids had access to school, whereas in the spring, there was basically no possible access for a lot of the kids who need school the most, kids who are behind, kids who live already in underserved communities, kids who might be homeless, kids who might be in foster care, the kids who really need the stability of school and whatever chance it might provide for them were completely cut off in the spring, which is unacceptable to begin with. So then in the fall of 2020, we had the technology set up. The problem, though, is that school online was really insufficient. And I think you can see now from the data of schools that did do the state testing, that kids fell really far behind. I know in Newark they did state testing, and it was really clear that the scores were much lower for third graders, for example, than they had been in previous years, and the number of kids failing those tests was a lot higher. I would say one issue we had in California was that districts were able to waive the state test because they wanted to spare the kids. But then we also don't really have a record of the learning loss that happened. So basically, that's one side of it, is just the academic part, where if you're a student who's very young, like kindergarten age, first grade, that time is really, really important for literacy. But at any time for kids who have disabilities, especially kids who have severe disabilities, to be cut off from school is a really terrible thing. For some kids, that is kind of almost a daily living need, basically. And the mental health component would be another aspect. So in addition to probably snowballing issues with literacy that we're going to see in the coming years, the isolation that kids experienced, the kind of abandonment they experience, being treated as a vector of disease only, I think is going to have a profound mental health impact for a long time. There's already data from the CDC that adolescents had a 30% increase in mental health ER visits. There was a big increase in suicide attempts among teen girls. But these are things that will probably affect people for a long time in their lives too. So the impact might not all be immediate.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned ER visits. I just want to make sure
Yeah.
everybody heard that. So we're talking about emergency room visits for depression,
Yeah.
or for, yep.
For mental health.
For mental health issues.
They don't specify, yeah.
And I hear this this word used over and over again, and it makes my blood boil. What's the phrase, actually? Well, children are resilient.
Yeah.
And yeah, that may be true, but that's not an excuse to abuse them.
Exactly.
And yet that seems to be, it's a little disturbing to me how many adults, and I am calling a lot of adults out here right now, who seem to be oblivious to the suffering of these children. It just boggles my mind.
Yeah. And now I think, well, I always wanted the schools to open back up and was always a proponent of that. I think one thing I didn't consider, because I'm not a parent, is the impact of masks. And I think parents have been more kind of aware of how that affects kids. And I think, well, some parents are not very aware of it. But from what I heard from parents from the beginning, when I would want schools to open, was sometimes that they didn't want their children to have a mask on all day. So I think that that's another area now where we're seeing kind of a certain level of abusive behavior towards kids because they have to cover their face, and there hasn't been really any studies that would in any way prove that that was beneficial. And none of the data from the United States, from schools that have been districts that have been open, from districts that have had masks, in any way indicates that the results were different when kids had masks on or didn't have masks on. And that's all documented on the dashboard. There's like a school's opening dashboard that people have put together. So that's kind of the next frontier of this. Hopefully the schools do stay open. And it's a little bit sad because I think with the same issue we had with the school closures was that a lot of the parent advocates for kids were often more affluent and got their districts to open up. It might be the same thing with masks, where we see low-income districts keep them for a much longer time than higher-income areas.
Wow. I mean, there's two issues here. One is the economic divide. You mentioned this earlier, which is some families have Wi-Fi at home and they have multiple computers, but that's not the norm.
Yeah.
And I think you said 30. What percentage of families from your look at this
So in the fall, I think everyone was pretty much covered because they distributed hotspots. But in the spring, so it was March, April, May, some of June for some areas. I think they said something like 30% of kids didn't have internet still, even after they gave computers and stuff.
So 30% of all children had no access to education March, April, May, June of 2020.
I think so, yeah.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. And how about the parents? I mean, we have an economy that's geared in such a way that to make a living and make the house payment, you kind of need both mother and father to be working. And obviously, if someone's got to be now home taking care of children, which someone's got to take care of the children, I know this is not directly related to what we were planning to talk about, but did you see an impact of this as well, of families being just completely disrupted, with mothers having to lose their jobs or quit from their jobs? Or
yeah, I'm not really sure. I mean, I think one thing that happened was that you would see a lot of older siblings being responsible for their younger siblings. I know, and having to do their Zoom class while they were watching other kids doing Zoom class. But I do know from the statistics that a huge number of women dropped out of the labor force. I can't remember the numbers, but a huge number, basically because they had to mind their kids at home to do school at home.
The last I looked, I think there's 10 million open jobs in the United States right now, and everybody's scratching their head, where did all the workers go? And I'm like, you got to be kidding. This is a shock to you? You completely turn people's lives upside down. And I guess people forget that someone's got to take care, look after, care for kids.
Yeah.
This seems to have been just, we don't worry about them being educated. Right. We don't worry about their mental health. We don't worry about whether they have caretakers or not. It just seemed to be not a non-issue. And yet we did consider kids as vectors of disease. Mm-hmm. That's the only way they seem to be viewed during this period. So that's one issue, is the economic issue, but also the age issue. I can't imagine a kindergartner or a first grader or a second, even a third grader, being able to sit in front of a computer all day and interact with teachers. I don't see how that's even physically possible.
Yeah, it's really not age appropriate.
Yeah, I mean,
because they need to be interacting and like touching things and playing and stuff. So it's completely not developmentally sound in any way.
Yeah, and it puts them in the position of, well, somehow they're bad for not,
Yeah,
complying with it. But, you can't ask a child that age. The other thing that's so strange, and I don't know how this is in Oakland, but, the whole idea of recess has
yeah,
been, and gym has been removed from a lot of schools. So they don't even
yeah.
give, yeah. How's that in Oakland? Do they have traditional, and when I was a kid, there was a period every day winter. I'm from the Northeast, and it might be freezing, but we were outside running around going nuts, which is what kids do, and we needed it. And I can't even imagine how one could get along taking that away from kids.
Well, it was kind of funny because when we had online school, first of all, I think the public is not super aware of how few hours it was. So I don't remember off the top of my head exactly the hours difference, but I think that uh, basically they they cut it almost in half, basically your amount of instructional time. And then they would send parents and kids these schedules where they would tell them, okay, and then here's your break for lunch and here's your break for recess or go outside or something, when they were doing online school, as though anyone would follow those suggested
They're
schedules.
delusional. These are profoundly delusional people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. So another question I have for you is you advocated for keeping the schools open, but I don't know how it was in your area, but where I live, the teachers and especially the teachers unions were vehement about not opening the school. So I'm wondering
Yeah.
what pressure you might have felt as an advocate for opening the schools, if any, and how it expressed itself. So there was pressure on
Um,
you.
Well, okay, so just in some of my background, I used to be very involved with the teachers union. So um, so it was a confusing experience. It was a
Mm,
difficult and confusing experience to watch that institution make a lot of what would be, in my opinion, enormous mistakes, both moral mistakes and strategic mistakes. So, um, I guess one story I would have is that when it became really clear that we weren't going to go back to school in the fall, one thing I went to my union with was that I wanted, or I felt it was necessary for kids with severe disabilities to still go to school, even if the rest of the kids were not going. Um, because my argument was that this is almost like a healthcare service. It's as essential. And the the thing that I think that was the experience that made me realize that people were just in some sort of hysteria because
mm,
they could not understand that argument. People who had been advocates for kids for a long time, or
mm.
people who had um, gone to great lengths to try to improve services for kids with disabilities for a long time, really did not understand that argument and kept saying, like, well, no teachers can go back until all the teachers can go back, or that somehow it wouldn't be safe for those kids. And it was as though like Europe didn't exist when they had a lot of schools open there. We have a neighboring district that's very affluent, it's Marin, and they had it's not neighbor, like nearby district, affluent district, um, that had services for kids with disabilities open since the spring. I had read it was maybe 60% of kids with disabilities were still getting their school services in the spring of 2020.
Wow.
So it was a huge equity problem that our students with disabilities were not getting their services. Um, and what ended up happening to those kids is that the district ended up, in a lot of cases, paying for private contractors to go house to house and provide like an hour of services every couple of days because they needed something in person.
This was in Marin?
No, sorry, this was in my district.
Oh,
In
okay.
Marin, I think those kids were in school.
They were actually in the school, but
Yeah.
so Oakland tried to do something with this traveling contractor.
Yeah, but and that's a private agency, not public school teachers. So basically, that's not very good if you're a union and your decision is leading to your district hiring private contractors not in your union to do your job.
And
That's
right,
not
and
a very good strategy.
and these would also be people that, by definition, don't know these kids.
Yes. And another thing that they did was that they had after school pods for the kids, for some of the kids with more moderate and severe disabilities. And they had not teachers, but paraprofessionals who have a different union were operating those pods. And it really didn't make sense because it was basically having lower paid workers who, you know, do the service instead of the teachers because the teachers union wouldn't allow the teachers to do it.
Wow.
So obviously teachers get paid more and they have a lot more training.
Right.
So basically, I think that I forgot where I was going, but it was not just bad for the kids what the union did. It was also terrible strategy because now everyone hates the teachers union. And if you're a public sector union, you really do need some community support.
Oh yeah.
you can't just end up in the position we're in now that the teachers are in now, that is you're incredibly unpopular. Your schools are losing tons of enrollment because of your decisions, and it has opened the door for a lot more privatization, which is exactly what the unions should be fighting against.
Wow. So when you say strategic mistake, but you said it was a moral mistake, which obviously it is. And,
yeah.
But now I'm getting to see the strategic mistake from the point of view of a teachers union. This was a really bad policy they adopted.
Yeah, I think so.
I've noticed that certain professions have been subject to lots of indoctrination, like, special seminars and webinars where everybody's supposed to log on and hear the latest fright stories. And I wonder if teachers were exposed to that as well. Like,
fright stories about COVID?
Yeah, like, if you even look at somebody from 100 yards away, you'll give them COVID and they'll be on a respirator. I mean, that kind of nonsense.
No, we didn't really have that. It was pretty voluntary. People, their fright was self-inflicted.
Okay, there was no special conditioning of the teachers' minds.
There was no special, there was conditioning that happened probably a long time ago that I wasn't really aware of, but there wasn't special conditioning for this.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah. Just curious. In a sense, we've all been conditioned for this for decades.
Yeah.
They're always referring to, hey, the big one's going to come someday, kind of like the earthquake, right? In San Francisco, it's like the big one's going to come. Maybe that's where they got it from, because so many of these propaganda agents are based in the, that create this propaganda are based in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
But we've been told the big one's coming, and 1918, that was so terrible.
Yeah.
And the thing about, I'll share this with you and with our listeners too, because it's an important piece of information, because this whole hysteria, as you called it, I believe, has been marinated for a long time. It wasn't like they just flipped the switch and suddenly everybody lost their mind. So one of the key frauds here is what happened in 1918. And one thing, for example, nobody did a death count when people were dying during the Great Influenza. There was no statistics kept at all. So those statistics were tabulated in the 1920s after the fact. There were no autopsies. There were no studies. It was a back-of-the-envelope guess, okay? Then everybody said, okay, well, that's over. We're done. 20 million died. Okay, chalk it up. Nobody ever talked about the Great Flu again until the 1980s. It went 60, 70 years of like, well, that was way back then. Suddenly, there became a cottage industry in revisiting the Great Flu of 1918, and some NIH studies, and that's when Tony Fauci, by the way, got into the NIH,
Hmm.
I'm not saying he was responsible, but he might have been. There were some new studies in 1980 based on nothing in the 1980s that said, oh, it wasn't 20 million, it was 50 million. Well,
Hmm.
you don't have to be a mathematician to know that the jump from 20 to 50 is very
It's
extreme.
big. Hmm.
And you better have something concrete if you're going to make a
Hmm.
jump like that. They had nothing. And now
Hmm.
if you read a lot of people, I wish I could think of his name. He's a very popular writer who wrote a book on the Great Flu. He just blithely says, well, 50 million is probably wrong. It was more like 100 million.
Hmm.
Now he's pulling this literally out of thin air. So anyway,
Yeah.
that narrative has been running nonstop since the 1980s.
Hmm.
And every time they talk about what's going on now and what we need to do and why it's so deadly and why it's so dangerous, they're always making reference to this story that may or may not have really happened the way they said it happened. One of the things people aren't aware of about 1918 is that was the World War I era, and
Hmm.
there was a massive mobilization, something like we can't even imagine today. And they literally pulled all the competent doctors and nurses out of hospitals and signed them up for the military. So they left
Hmm.
skeletal staffs in every single
Right.
hospital in America. And then they're
Right.
surprised, and I don't know if you've ever been in a hospital or ever visited anybody in a
Hmm.
hospital. Under the best of circumstances, those places are challenged to be charitable about it. So if you pull out the competent people, God knows what's going to happen in a hospital. So
Yeah.
yeah. And they were doing things like, and then we'll get back to the current events, but I just want to share this with you and our listeners because it's such a critical story. They were taking, pretty well-fed, well-exercised farm boys from Kansas and shipping them to these training places where they were living in tents, in some cases without heating, eating garbage food, stressed out, of course, because they're away from home. And when the flu started, they banned them from even standing around wood-burning stoves together.
Hmm.
Well, if you're exposed to the cold and you're being
Yeah.
poorly fed and you're away from home and the sanitation's not that good,
Yeah.
I think people are going to get sick of something. So anyway,
Yeah.
size,
Well, I mean, it's kind of interesting because so much of the disease eradication that they did really revolved around improving labor conditions, regulating the food, plumbing and sewage, cleaning up the cities, um, all those things. And so it's kind of weird that people think that like affluent people in with all of these things are going to be susceptible to the super virus when
exactly.
that's just really not really has anything to do with the history of epidemics or the conditions that they thrive in at all.
Well, they always talk about the four horsemen of the apocalypse: famine, war, and then one of them is pestilence.
Yeah.
Well, they come together. Wars
Yeah,
create
they can,
famine,
yeah.
right? And your point is really really important that healthy people have a lot of resistance to these
Yeah,
things.
exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
and I noted this, and I wonder what your thoughts on this are too. Is we had science and medicine pre 2020, and
Hmm.
then once 2020 came, it was literally all thrown out the window.
Yeah.
Suddenly everyone needed to wear a mask. Suddenly, you know, it was unsafe for people to be together. Uh,
Yeah.
Suddenly, children were these horrible disease bearers. None of this stuff was ever part of medical practice before, and suddenly it was accepted as if it had been proven by some kind of science. Um, talking about the masks, maybe we'll talk. Oh, by the way, I want to show you this. You've probably seen this sign, right?
Oh, is that from 1918?
Yeah, it's from 1918, and they're basically the people that are against masking all got together at the Dreamland skating rink um, to hear about the State Board of Health's bulletin showing that compulsory mask wearing is a failure
Yeah.
and that it's unhealthy. This was 100 years ago, and somehow we forgot that. But
Yeah.
what's so strange about masks is, they're called surgical masks for a reason.
Hmm.
They're worn by people in surgical theaters, doing operations,
Yeah.
and they were meant to protect the patients that are being opened up. They weren't,
Yeah.
they had no other purpose. And there were things people were supposed to do, like you change them every several hours.
Yeah.
You certainly don't go to lunch and hang one off your ear while you're having lunch and then put it back on. In other words, that's another example of basic medical practice just being absolutely thrown out the window. And I guess that's what happened in education.
Yeah, 100%. Because I mean, it's kind of funny because a lot of times in education, what you'll hear people say is that it doesn't, now they'll say this, is that it doesn't matter if kids miss out on some years of their education because the standards are arbitrary and that's a one-size-fits-all model, and kids develop at different rates or stuff like that. And that's just not true. I mean, there are milestones. I mean, there's different times when people can hit milestones, right? But there's a range. And also, if you are, let's say, not in the typical range, it still really matters that the earlier you get certain interventions, the better the outcome will be. So again, for kids with disabilities, yeah, so they're not going to maybe meet the same standards at the same time as their typical age peers, but you want them to have interventions in their education as early as possible. And the outcomes for them will be much better if those interventions happen at an earlier age, which is why a lot of times kids with disabilities from more affluent backgrounds have much higher chances of being independent later in life than kids from lower income backgrounds where they didn't get certain services as early. But basically, it is very similar because it's not like there was one group of teachers who didn't care about the standards in 2019, and there was another group of teachers who did care about the standards. And now in 2021, the group who doesn't care one or something. It's exactly the same people who in 2019 were talking about the standards and rigorous instruction who are now saying that standards and rigorous instruction don't really matter. So
Unbelievable.
Their minds, I don't know, I don't know if it's because when you're scared, you just lose your mind or something or what, but it's a complete reversal, basically, from a lot of the dogma that we had before, because maybe almost to a too great degree, a lot of times in schools, teachers and administrators are just obsessed with time and getting things, getting things done and meeting certain markers.
Checked off.
Yes,
Yeah.
almost maybe too much. It becomes very like mechanical and oppressive for kids. And now it's the opposite. Just complete reversal.
Wow. Wow. I hadn't thought of that as one of the outcomes of this. You talk
Yeah,
about,
and
yeah.
sorry, the only other thing I would say is that they're also like had basically been some arguments around keeping kids online where people were saying that it was actually better for some kids because they weren't getting in trouble at school. It's a
Unbelievable.
really strange argument. Like, we're not going to fix our disciplinary system at school. We'll just effectively kick kids out.
Wow. Oh, my mind is reeling. I mean, it's, you mentioned the word dogma, but in fact, what we're really talking about is common sense. First of all,
Yeah.
it's a technical term in intervention, but what it really is support.
Yeah,
Like,
it's support.
how can anybody question that
Yeah.
children need support? I mean, or that they can just, we'll put the child on ice, at age 6 for a year, 2
Yeah.
years, and we'll pick it up later. That's not how
Yeah.
it works.
It's just not true. I mean, it's just everyone knows if you learn to read earlier, it will be much faster and much easier for you. And if for any reason you didn't learn to read in the right developmental time, you can still learn to read, but it'll be a lot harder and it will take a lot longer.
Yeah.
And so why would you go through that if you could just have school? It just doesn't make sense.
But this is a really important learning for me. I did not know this, and it didn't occur to me that the attitudes of teachers and schools have been changed 180 degrees by all this. From the idea of having some kind of standards and being concerned about supporting kids and concerned about milestones to, and I'm not talking about lockstep thing where, hey, you're not reading by the age of six and a
Yeah.
half, therefore we're going to lose our minds. I'm not talking about that. But I'm talking about, being aware that 6-year-olds are different than 7-year-olds. They have different needs. They have different requirements. There's things that you want to achieve with 6-year-olds that are important at age 6. And it's not like a kid can wait. I'm
Yeah.
thinking of the 5-year-olds. I mean, actually, the younger they are, the more significant the passage of time is. Like a year
Yeah,
for a
exactly.
4-year-old is massive.
Yeah, and that's what's really scary too, because also for kids, a lot of times whatever is happening to them is normal. So if you're 12 and school's closed for a year, to you that's just what 12 is being like.
Right,
They
right.
don't have
That's true. They don't have
perspective. Yeah.
and why would they? They can't
Yeah.
have perspective. It's our job to keep our heads together and provide them with perspective and a
Yeah.
framework for them to develop. It's not we shouldn't be, changing the laws of medicine, science, and apparently education to conform to some pseudo-scientific lunacy.
Yeah.
But that's apparently, I mean, that's what we did. Hey, when you wrote your article, The War on Reality, did you get any pushback? Did you get any support? Because it's a brilliant article. I recommend everybody read it. I've got a link to it.
I mean, mostly support. I mean, there's always people who will say you're wrong. I mean, it's not
but there was no organized. Nobody made you the poster girl.
Not that I know of.
Okay, well, you would know, believe me, if they did it.
Yeah.
So I guess because as I'm reading your article, which is everyone needs to read it, I'm thinking I can't believe they didn't cancel this person and cancel her article, because there've been a lot of great articles that people have written that have been taken down. I know Medium.com is one of the great offenders of that. Who I forget who published.
It was Tablet Magazine.
Yeah, bless them.
Yeah.
I don't know if people are aware, but Bill and Melinda Gates underwrite Medium.com.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And actually, when I don't know what they do these days, but when they were trying to show people how cool Medium was, Melinda Gates was sort of the spokesmodel for that. You can find a lot of pages with her. So some very important articles were erased by Medium. Well, good for Tablet. Are they? Do you know anything about them? Are they Bay Area based or?
I think they're based in New York.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah, but they've been doing some good pieces in general on COVID and kind of alternate perspectives. So they just had one today or yesterday or around this time about vaccine hesitancy. That was really good. That was basically discussing how you can't expect people to trust the media and their elected officials and the pharmaceutical industry after 5 years of absolute chaos and lies about everything.
Yeah, I mean, the governor of New York just had to step down. He was the biggest cheerleader for this. I have a feeling Newsom's on his way out. It's just a matter of time. Fauci hasn't given the same story twice the entire time.
Yeah.
So, and then of course this industry, the pharmaceutical industry, has a horrific record. They're even more criminal than Wall Street, which is really, I mean, we're talking, when I say criminal, I mean felony charges against
racketeering.
Yeah. I mean, it's not getting a few things wrong.
Yeah.
So, and then, the news media, I think, is so beneath contempt for most people. And yet a lot of people get their information from it. Speaking of the news media, I don't know if you saw yesterday, the Wall Street Journal had an op-ed, which initially cheered me, but then I read it carefully and then it disturbed me. It's called The Case Against Masks for Children. And I thought, yeah, great.
Yeah.
And then they had a little takeout, where it said it's abusive to force kids who struggle with them to sacrifice. for the sake of unvaccinated adults. Then I'm like, wait a minute, what's
Oh
this
no.
article really about? So I started to read it, and basically what they're doing now is saying, well, if you're not vaccinated, you're the reason children have to wear masks.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's always like that. I find there's a lot of times when I'll see something and I'll think it's good pushback on all that's going on, and then you read more closely and it's actually seeding 99% of the narrative.
Yep. Yep. And this came not
Yeah.
surprisingly from Johns Hopkins University,
Yeah.
which School of Medicine, which is one of the chief promoters of fraudulent medicine. I mean, I'll just say it. You don't have to
Right.
agree with me, but I'm going to say it.
But that's the case a lot with a lot of in any kind of mainstream news source. When I do see pushback on vaccine mandates or the idea of vaccine passports, they'll still affirm like every adult and child should be vaccinated as soon as possible, but we shouldn't like hold people down and force them,
Yeah.
is the line that they're drawing. So it's kind of giving up a lot of, major points.
It's the line that they're drawing for now.
For now,
I mean,
exactly,
they
yeah.
basically told, in a lot of states, not all, if you're a medical professional, you have to do it. And this is so interesting, and they won't talk about this ever. Medical professionals not enthusiastic about the vaccine. Many of them, doctors, nurses, not enthusiastic, not getting it.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that no one asks why.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing is similar to also so those are, I guess, frontline workers and other essential workers and stuff also are hesitant. And some of that might be because they've been working the entire time and they know that the risks are overblown, or they recovered and they know they have natural immunity. So that might be one big factor in why they don't want to get it. But that's completely ignored because it's not about immunity.
Yeah. And or they may have observed so many problems with vaccines over the years that
that's another part. Yeah.
They're not enthusiastic about it.
Yeah.
Now the thing they're doing now, I got this from Johns Hopkins. It was buried back in May. It was very interesting. The word variant.
Yeah.
If you go to Google Trends, was just sort of trending along like this.
Yeah.
Until May. And then it went whoosh, straight up. Okay. And I always try to find the source of these things because there often is a specific source, and it turned out to be Johns Hopkins.
Mm-hmm.
And the logic that they were laying down in May, and it hasn't quite spread out across the world yet, but it's doing a good job of spreading out. What they're trying to tell us is that, well, because the rest of the world isn't vaccinated, all kinds of variants are brewing. And those variants are coming to the U.S. That's line of baloney number one. The next line is that we can't achieve herd immunity because 25% of the population are children.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is what Johns Hopkins was saying in May.
Yeah.
And until we vaccinate the children, we can never go back to normal. So this is the noose, they're trying to put around our necks.
Yeah.
Just so I don't know if you were aware that it was Johns Hopkins that laid out this logic back in May when no one else even was using the word variant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, please.
No, I forgot.
Okay. Yeah, it's distressing. Well, what... writing these articles is very important because this is such a great article. It's The War on Reality, and you can find it. It's written by Alex Gutentag. It's on tablet. I strongly recommend you read it, everybody. It's one of the best surveys of all the medical fraud, which has been, and news media fraud, which has been significant. And like I said at the beginning of the call, I wish more reporters would just document hey, on this day they said this, and then 3 weeks later it was a different thing. I mean, this has been going on since day one.
Yeah.
Since day one. What are you recommending to friends, to family, to parents who you have a chance to talk with, to get through this, to survive, to maintain their sanity and their spirits?
I don't know, because I'm pretty lost in it myself. I think that um, I think it's important to remember that uh, to not lose hope, I guess. I think that what we're seeing now with the vaccine mandates and passports is that similar to what they did with lockdowns, it's going to be the same playbook everywhere, every country, and they'll just present it slightly different or call it some different app or whatever. And it's going to probably play out differently in each country. So just because they're using the same playbook doesn't mean that the response is going to be the same. And for example, what we're seeing now in France is one place where obviously it's getting really extreme. It might not necessarily get to that point here. It really depends how people respond at each level. So I think that everyone has a decision to make as an individual in real time, whether you get the vaccine or not. Because if we have here in California any kind of pass system, people can still decide not to frequent businesses that implement it, or people can, whether you're vaccinated or not, or people can decide to like confront businesses that implement it. You can decide to not ever download any kind of app on your phone that is in any way related to your vaccine status. I think there's going to be basically like consumer choices happening in real time that affect it a lot, whether it can be implemented efficiently. And also, I would say that if you're, I don't know, I mean, it's really, really hard not to give into the pressure around the vaccine. So I think, you know, if it's being mandated in your job or your school, look into exemptions because it is possible, and try to fight for it, basically.
Gotcha,
Yeah.
gotcha. I live in the Hudson Valley of New York City, of New York State,
Yeah.
and they're claiming that, you know, it's out of control, and then I look at the numbers and it's like it's nothing.
Yeah, it's just,
And of course they're still playing the same game of somebody's hospitalized with COVID, not necessarily caused by, their hospitalization has not necessarily been caused by COVID. They may have had, you know,
yeah.
diabetes, cancer, stroke, heart attack, but if they run a COVID test, and we know how unreliable they are,
Yeah.
and it turns up positive, they're going to declare that that hospitalization is a COVID
Yeah.
hospitalization. But even with juicing the numbers that way, it's still
Still really low.
low. I mean, and the death is nothing. There's no deaths. Um,
But that's like, I feel like so interesting because I mean, in the first round, uh, they had really inflated numbers, and now they don't even have the numbers. They don't. Their statistical lies are not even very good right now, and yet it's still convincing a lot of people.
yeah, they don't even bother. I mean, I saw a headline from
Yeah,
CNN. Um, the variant is out of control in Florida. Well,
yeah,
what does that mean?
yeah. They
They've
don't
got
even.
no.
Yeah, you're right. They don't even bother anymore. It's
And,
all just a fantasy.
and a lot of people have been conditioned, millions of people, unfortunately,
Yeah,
to accept this.
yeah,
And, you know, we have family members that are just out of their minds with fear. And I'm like, look around you. Who do you see dropping dead? Um,
yeah,
who do you know? You know, and I hear, oh, well,
yeah,
I know somebody whose brother-in-law knew a guy and his sister worked with a guy. I'm like, well, this is,
yeah.
you know,
No, it's yeah,
and then I hate to say it, but, you know, you see, they go, and this, by the way, this was, I don't know, I don't want to get too far afield, but this was a trick Fauci played 40 years ago with HIV and AIDS.
yeah,
They would say, otherwise healthy young men, well, it turned out, and I know this story very, very well, it turned out the original generation of people that developed real AIDS, they weren't healthy at all,
hmm.
okay? And it was a fraud to call them healthy. And I see the same thing with COVID when they say, oh, well, this healthy young person, and then you see a photograph of them, and no offense, but we're talking about obesity on a level that
Yeah.
is really frightening, like not a little bit of extra weight. We're talking
Yeah.
about way
Fatal.
over
Yeah.
fatal.
Fatal.
And, apparently that is one of the risk, well, it's one of the risk factors for every disease.
Yeah.
And it's one of the risk factors for this, and they never talk about that. That's never meant. In fact, I don't know if you've seen this. I see a lot of TV commercials like glorifying. There's one with this a ice cream commercial. I don't know if you've seen it. It's
Hmm.
a guy just sitting there eating ice cream, watching other people exercise and do healthy things. And there's like a line, I should exercise. But he's just stuffing his face. It's like they're almost encouraging people to like engage in unhealthy behavior.
Yeah, well, they are. I mean, the whole stay home thing is one of the least healthy things you could possibly do. I mean, they know that vitamin D is really important. We know now also that obesity was a huge risk factor, and a lot of people only gained weight during the lockdown. Um, it was the most counterproductive advice possible.
There's something I saw, I wish I could give you the exact reference, but it talked about things that contribute to health and a long life and, good diet, fresh air, all this stuff. And of course, close personal relationships,
Yeah,
very
exactly.
important.
Yeah.
But here's the one that blew me away. The number one, I think I did publish it on my website somewhere, but the number one factor was multiple social interactions, not profound ones, not
Yeah.
like best friend forever stuff, not seeing grandpa or anything or
Hmm.
grandma, just seeing the clerk at the post office. The UPS
Yeah.
guy comes, you say hi, you're walking down the street. Apparently, those little human interactions are the best predictor of
Mm.
health more than fresh air and exercise.
Yeah.
And I remember reading this article long ago about an island in the Mediterranean, Greek island, where people live forever. Like, like
Yeah.
people that are 110 are like normal, they're,
Yeah.
and the deal was people saw each other, chatted,
Yeah.
nodded, the whole
Yeah.
bit. So removing that from life, and we've seen reports I saw a report in Australia just a couple of weeks ago where a public health official in Sydney was saying if masked up, if you see your friend in the supermarket,
Right. Don't. Yeah.
restrict the impulse to talk with them.
Yeah.
So this has got to be killing people.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's probably, I mean, besides what they did in the nursing homes in 5 states to send COVID patients there, I think besides that whole issue, I think it had a huge impact on the deaths spiking all at the same time everywhere, was isolating old people who maybe their deaths would have been distributed more over time, but all of a sudden they were hit with huge amounts of stress and then completely isolated when loneliness, just what you're saying, basically, loneliness is a huge risk factor for the elderly.
It's cutting off their support.
Yeah.
And, the worst punishment in prison is solitary
Solitary,
confinement.
yeah.
And that's what a lot of these older people in these institutions were put in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's also how I mean, if in terms of manipulating people, psychological manipulation or control, the first thing that you would do to condition someone is to isolate them.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think the level of intense division we're seeing now and how much just, I don't know, even exterminationist language people will use about other, of their fellow citizens that they never would have thought of using 2 years ago is because to a certain extent, some of their minds were basically just broken from isolation or from being cut off and kind of losing touch with their previously held values and beliefs.
Mm, mm. And they've been told that that children and other unvaccinated people are of danger to them.
Yeah,
I mean,
and they'll, I mean, the logic, it doesn't. There is no logic. Like there's just no logic. If
yeah.
your vaccine protects you, then it protects you. if you want other people to get the vaccine, you can't keep telling them that your vaccine doesn't really work.
Yeah, and then they throw these down. Apparently there was an outbreak of the variant, of the Delta variant, which is a big joke in itself because I've talked to a virologist and he says there were already thousands of variants back
Yeah.
in March of
Yeah.
2020. That's the nature of the beast. And, there are, Delta just means four.
Yeah.
It's a Greek letter, as you know, and
Yeah.
and and now they didn't pick epsilon or zeta or nu or some other obscure word. They used delta. Well, why? Because there's associations with swamps and
Right.
mosquitoes and pestilence,
Right.
So, but anyway, the Delta variant apparently broke out in Provincetown, Massachusetts, and
Hmm.
70% of the people that
Yeah.
got it were vaccinated.
Yeah.
70%, you know. So you're right. The illogic, we've left, logic has left the room,
Yeah.
to say the least. Well, any other things you've written that we should know about? Because again, I love the War on Reality. It really cheered me up when I saw it to know somebody's out there doing something. Um, have you written anything recently?
No, I don't have anything recent, but I do have more coming.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, great. Well, we've been talking with Alex Gutentag. Alex, thank you so much for your
Yeah, thank you
time.
so much for having me.